Boker Tov, everyone. This week we're learning the Parsha of Balak, and in some ways this is a very peculiar story, but in other ways it's not. So there are two antagonists. The two villains of the story are the king Balak, of one of the nations that Israel is going to have to face, and this man, Bilam. Now, Bilam is very interesting because he's kind of a prophet. And when I say that he's a prophet, in Jewish tradition, it's often said that if he had been Jewish, he basically would have been Moses. I'm kind of paraphrasing and oversimplifying it, but his prophetic powers to be able to talk to the one true God were great. The question is, what did he do with those powers? And that's what this story is about, how he abused those powers. He used them basically, he was given this incredible gift from God, but he sold it out to the highest bidder, to Balak. However, in the very end, the famous moment is that Bilam was hired to basically use his prophetic and almost magical abilities to curse the people. And God kept trying to stop him through the talking donkey, which again, there are talking animals in the Torah. Go back to the story of creation, not that wild, the talking snake. But Bilam keeps going. And by the way, he does everything by the books. He makes offerings to God. He follows the procedure that a prophet would, but he's going to use it against God's chosen nation, Israel. So hello Sherman, welcome. So when Bilam finally comes to curse us, instead of cursing us, what comes out of his mouth are those famous words, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. How good, we'll read that inside as well, but how good are your tents, O Israel, your dwelling place, or Yaakov, how your dwelling place is Israel. So God decides, you know what, I tried to convince you to make the choice yourself. It's a fascinating discussion about free will. God tried to convince Bilam to not follow through with his plan to curse God's chosen people, his children, who are not powerless, but in many ways, were very fragile and vulnerable at this point in history. But ultimately, at the final moment, God says, I can't have this happen. So a question about, will God let all of history just happen regardless of people's choices? And no, God will step in, particularly at this point in history, and God changes the words that comes out of Bilam's mouth from a curse into a blessing. So there's so much to think about there, again, about free will, about the relationship between God and God's chosen people, about the fact that there are people who are not descendants of Israel who can still have a connection with God. That's another kind of takeaway here, is people can talk to God who aren't Jews. Jews need to be not be so Jew-centric and realize that God speaks to other peoples and other nations. So there's all of these things going on. And a lot of people say this story is weird because, right now we're mostly having in Bamidbar, the stories told from Moshe's perspective are the people's. This one is happening outside. Well, again, the first half of the entire Torah happens outside of the people's perspective. Moses is not around for all the stuff that happens at the beginning, A, and B, even though the Israelites may not have been aware of this, who's to say that God didn't then go down to Moshe and say, I want you to know something that happened, both to learn the lesson that I will protect you no matter what, that there are other prophets out there, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a beautiful, deep, rich tapestry of a story, but it's not as weird and peculiar and out of place as people think, particularly at this vulnerable moment in the narrative of the Torah. We need to hear that God is protecting us from threats we're not even aware of, whether it's asteroids hitting Earth or evil, or not even evil, but corrupt prophets who have been given a gift and are misusing it. But what I want to focus on today is that actual blessing that came out of his mouth. Because if God took over Bilam's ability to speak and put these words into his mouth or inspired him to say these blessing words, why these words? Now, it essentially is a poem that, Jane, I'll unmute you in a moment and you'll read it. It's a beautiful poem, this blessing. And again, as a poem, it can be interpreted in many ways, but we'll look at some of the classical ways it's been interpreted and how that can speak to us, because basically what Bilam says is, this is the best of you, Israel. This is what makes you awesome. And we should hear that and say, those are the values and the attributes that we as Jews today should still be striving to live up to. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would take, and again, this is both the introduction, the famous line, and then the full poetic blessing that Bilam gives as he's looking over our people, that eventually our people become aware of this moment. So Jane, please.
Now Bilam, seeing that it pleased Adonai to bless Israel, did not, as on previous occasions, go in search of omens, but turned his face toward the wilderness. As Bilam looked up and saw Israel encamped tribe by tribe, the Spirit of God came upon him. Taking up his theme, he said, "Word of Bilam, son of Beor, word of the man whose eye is true, word of him who hears God's speech, who beholds visions from the Almighty, prostrate but with eyes unveiled. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by Adonai, like cedars beside the water. Their boughs drip with moisture, their roots have abundant water. Their king shall arise above Agag, their kingdom shall be exalted. God who freed them from Egypt is for them like the horns of the wild ox. They shall devour enemy nations, crush their bones, and smash their arrows. They crouch, they lie down like a lion, like the king of beasts. Who dare rouse them? Blessed are they who bless you, accursed they who curse you. Enraged at Balaam, Balak struck his hands together. I called you, Balak said to Balaam, to damn my enemies, and instead you have blessed them these 3 times.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. So of this blessing, and again, is it blessing he's saying, I hope these things happening, or is he praising things that are already true? And it appears like it's somewhere in between there. It's a little bit of praise about our nature, but it's a little bit of God inspiring, not taking over his mouth, but inspiring him to say these things that we hope will be in the true in the future. Now, some of these blessings, even though they're poetic, it's pretty obvious it's about military might and conquering our enemies, no problem. Those, and by the end, a kind of self-referential thing, those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed. And this is a moment where someone who was trying to curse you ended up blessing them. So the question is, what's going to happen to Bilam now that ultimately has blessed God's chosen nation? But it's that middle part in the beginning that is really unclear. What is it talking about? What does it mean? We're like aloes planted by God, cedars beside the water, our bows, all of this plant imagery dripping with moisture. And it all starts off with this line, ma tovu. Ma can mean what or how much, like how amazing, like manora, how incredible, awesome this is. So ma tovu, how good, like it's really good. Ohalecha means your tents, Yaakov. And again, we'll come back to that, why it says Yaakov and then Israel. So how good are your tents, Yaakov? Mishkenotacha Yisrael. Mishkan from the word shachen, meaning to dwell, like neighborhood. How good are your tents, your neighborhoods, your dwelling spaces, Yisrael. So it uses the 2 names of Yaakov, then Yisrael, and it uses 2 names to refer to, an ohel is a specific structure, and a mishkan can either actually refer to the Mishkan, their portable temple, or it can just be like the areas in which you live, your neighborhoods. But what's going on here? Why is the blessing start with talking about how pretty your tents are? And then it talks about our military might and all this plant imagery. So there's no one right answer to this. We're going to look at a couple different classical rabbinic answers to this, and whether or not they're right, they're beautiful, interesting, and again, they kind of get at what's awesome about Israel. What should we be striving to make our priorities? What are the best things of us that we should strive, again, to make the best things about us? And then we'll end with a piece that really, doesn't try and get a literal interpretation at all. It takes it totally poetically in a beautiful way. So Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and I'll zoom in as much as I think I can. Yeah, I think that's good there. And this is a classical source. It's a good place. One of the earliest sources to discuss this is from the Talmud, in the section Sanhedrin, which often deals with civil and court law, but here it's getting into Midrash, interpreting what's going on here. So Isabel, please. Rabbi Yochanan says.
Rabbi Yochanan says, from the blessing of that wicked person, Balaam, you can ascertain what was in his heart. God transformed the curses that he planned into blessings. He sought to say that they should not have synagogues and study halls, and he said instead, how goodly are your tents, Yaakov, a blessing on their synagogues. He sought to say that the divine presence, Shekhinah, will not rest upon them. And he said instead, and your dwellings, Mishkanot, Israel. He sought to say that the kingdom of Israel would not continue. And he said instead that it would continue, like the winding brooks which flow continuously. He sought to say that they would have no olive trees and vineyards. And he said instead, like gardens by the riverside. He sought to say that their fragrance would not diffuse from their fulfillment of mitzvot. And he said instead, like aloes that the Lord has planted.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Isabel. Now, it is not wild to look at the blessings that Bilam gave and then to think, what should this have looked like? If it talks about military victory, and the whole point of Balak, the king, was he wanted them to fail militarily, that he probably asked Bilam to curse them that they would fail militarily. So the way that this midrash in the Talmud is written makes a lot of sense. It's a very logical way to take each part of the blessing and say, based on what it says, this is probably what he meant. Now, you can tell from some of them that it gets a little bit more poetic on this side, like when it talks about fulfillment of mitzvot and the sweet smell that creates. That's probably not a literal read of that, but the idea that the Israelites that are hoping to go into the land of milk and honey and have this whole agricultural society, that they might be cursed, that all their crops fail. And this is saying, no, your crops should grow in great numbers, is beautiful. But the first two things are very interesting, because if you ask a rabbi, certainly a classical rabbi, where should all Jews spend their day? They should spend their days in shul or in a yeshiva studying Torah. So we'll come back to this, I think, in a moment, but one of the classical explanations for why specifically the focus on an ohel, it's not about, oh, your house is really nice. It's the structures that you build to learn Torah and pray to God. Those are places that you hang in all the time. Basically, your synagogues are, it's not literal, it's metaphorical, but your ohel is nice is a way of saying your shuls are thriving and filled with people. Your academies are filled with people learning Torah. And then why Mishkan? Because you've already talked about your structures. Well, Mishkan can be a literal physical structure, or in this case, they're saying it refers to God's presence that we are aware of, the Shekhinah. God is one. I was going to hold up two fingers. No, God is one, but God manifests us in different ways, through miracles, through clouds, through a feeling in our hearts, etc. But when we feel that God is present, God is everywhere. When we feel God's presence, that is the God who's our neighbor, who dwells amongst us, the Shekhinah, which is a feminine noun, but that's the Mishkonotecha. So your shuls are beautiful, full of people davening. And I was gonna say, I wish that God wouldn't be with you, but I can tell that God walks among you, which is, by the way, in the Torah, not in the Midrash, in the Torah, one of the fears of the people after the sin of the golden calf is that God would not dwell amongst us. And what's Bilam's blessing? God will dwell amongst you, or at least this interpretation. So again, the structure of this Talmud, how it breaks down each blessing and imagines the curse is great. Is it always, perfectly logical? The one about military, I think that's a great read of it. The other ones go either way. What we're going to look at now is how the rabbis, inspired by this piece and other possible reads, this Rashi got disconnected, but how they've interpreted. So Sherman, if I can unmute you, and I will give you this next source. So Rashi, who often brings in the midrashic accounting, actually goes pretty straightforward with this in interpreting what an ohel, what does it mean by you have lovely tents? So again, the Talmudic understanding of tents is your synagogues. And again, that's very, I want to say it's very anachronistic, meaning something that didn't exist in that time looking backwards, but it kind of is. What did we have thousands of years later? We had synagogues and academies. We didn't have them in the time of the Torah. In the time of the Torah, our tents were tents. So Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, go ahead, Sherman, source number 3.
How goodly are thy tents, he said. He said this because he saw that the entrance of their tents were not exactly facing each other.
Excellent, thank you. So Rashi reads this as talking about literal tents. Now the question is, okay, it just means something is awesome about our tents, but again, that's weird. Why do we care about our tents? And what he says, we'll actually come back to in just a moment. But if the front door of my house is wide open to my neighbor's house, and I live in a small little hut, and our entrances face each other, what am I going to be able to see, and what are they going to be able to see? And the answer is everything. They didn't have bathrooms; they would go off to a secret place for that. But privacy, changing, there would be no such thing. And many suggested that what Rashi is talking here is people sleeping together, is men and women having sex with each other, and that privacy is being respected. And there are hints in the Torah about that kind of privacy and about what happens in tents, and that this word, your tents, could be code for there's a sense of respect of the privacy between different couples and families. And again, we'll come back to that because that's picked up on in later generations about privacy. So one interpretation is it is literally about tents. It's not about shuls, et cetera, like that. It's your tents. And the reason that tents are important is because the way they're set up, it shows this mutual respect. Now, that's not something that we can take out of the Torah, but we can guess that the Torah meant something is awesome about their tents. But this next source here, we really don't need to bring it because he basically is saying what the Talmud says. This is Obadiah 4:no, is talking about the beauty of learning Torah and yeshivot, et cetera, like that. But it's a really nice source. So those are kind of the two main interpretations of what a tent is. And we haven't focused on Mishkan. We'll come back to that later. But a tent is either a literal tent, why that's important, not clear, or it's figurative for the places of study, which again, that's kind of anachronistic. But the other thing that I said we should pay attention into this class is, based on the way we understand this, it talks about what our values are. So Rashi says one of our values should be respecting each other's privacies. Sforno and the Talmud say that one of our values should be praying to God, coming together as a community, learning, education. Those should be our top priorities. That should be what Israel is known for respecting each other's rights and for valuing education and gratitude above all. And that's a statement, whether or not that's literally what's meant. I think that's a beautiful takeaway from all of this. If we look at this speech of Bilam for what's the best of the Jews, respecting each other's privacy and learning Torah. Now, that idea of respecting privacy comes back in a very interesting way. So Rabbi Chaim Jachter, a contemporary rabbi out of Jersey, he writes prolifically. He actually builds eruvs. And he teaches a high school. He does everything. And he wrote these books that are all available online for free on sefaria.org, Sefaria, from the word for library, called Gray Matter, the part of your brain you want to build up. And he covers these fascinating topics of Jewish law in depth. And here he talks about privacy. So if I go to my neighbor's house with a baseball bat and I smash their ming vase, and he takes me to court, I'm going to have to pay for his ming vase. It's pretty clear that I've damaged his property. But what if I'm sitting in my window, like the old Alfred Hitchcock movie, with a telescope, and I'm just staring into their house, watching him make dinner, watching him do other things? Have I damaged him? And if I actually caused damage, the question is privacy, visual privacy, is that a form of damage? So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would please take this source number 5. And again, the full article is available online, or you can buy his books. But he's a rock star of the contemporary Jewish world. Please.
It is important to call attention to this case because it adjudicated an important halacha that is often neglected in our times. Hezek
re'iyah. Hezek means to damage, and re'iyah from the word ro'eh, to see. So what he says, visual trespass.
The Gemara devotes much attention to this subject at the beginning of the tractate Bava Batra. It is especially important halacha, as Hazal teach that Bilam praises the Jewish people upon seeing that their neighbors position their windows and the entrances to their homes in a manner that protects the privacy of one another.
Excellent, thank you. And where else did we see that? I'll scroll up. Rashi bases his comment on Bava Batra, on the Talmud, and the idea that privacy and respect of people's private space is so valuable that Bilam would say that Israel, one of your greatest traits is respecting each other's, again, individual rights. Now, I'm saying individual rights. That's kind of not exactly what they're saying. They're being more specific, but I would feel comfortable in a drash interpreting that more broadly. But again, specifically the idea of just respecting that people have places where they need to be alone, where they can have their own sacred space. Jewish law supports that, and the Torah perhaps hints at that. Certainly the Talmud says so. And again, the point here is not necessarily what the text actually says, but how we understand it and what it implies about what the best of Israel is. So we've seen the best of Israel, again, is respect to privacy, and I would say individual rights, and about valuing education. Now, as I said, we're only focusing really on that. We're actually really focused mostly on that word ohel, tents, not mishkan, although the Talmud kind of explored that a little bit. But I'm sure there's countless other ways to understand this beautiful poem of Bilam. But the key thing is here is Bilam is saying, I'm going to summarize why Israel is awesome. And these are the things about Israel that are incredible. I hope they stay incredible. And that can really speak to us today. Whether in privacy is a big issue today, both on a federal level, both on a digital level. It's something that is constantly under attack. And I don't know in Israel law about privacy rights, but you know what? Maybe it's something that should be more of a conversation as we go into an age when privacy has disappeared, to say that literally the greatest blessing of Israel that we ever got was about our respect of privacy. So this is an incredibly relevant and important conversation to still be had that is born out of a moment in the Torah between us and a potential great enemy that God turned into a celebration of what the best of us is. So before I read the final piece here, are there any thoughts, comments, or questions up until now? Excellent. So this last piece here I really like. So Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, Rav Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of British Mandate Palestine, so, for 100 years ago. And he was brilliant in many ways, both for his respect for other Jews and other non-Jews, and in his writings. The challenge with his writing, though, it was incredibly esoteric. He was not Hasidic per se, but he was a mystic. And you could see a lot of that in his writing. His writing is also very poetic. So to get through his writing is nearly impossible to begin with. Now, if you wanted to say, fine, I'll break my teeth on his works, but show me the book that he writes about the Torah and his interpretation, you don't have that either. He has dozens of books that have thoughts all over the place, legal, philosophical, on the Torah. So fortunately, there's an incredible work also available online called Gold from the Land of Israel. And the other one, there's like 2 volumes, maybe Silver from the Land. And it is not his word for word, but it's somebody who went through his works and then summarized the ideas of Rav Kook into more accessible speech. So these are not a translation of his words, but it's definitely capturing what he's going to say. And even though this is meant to be easily accessible, you can still get a hint at some of the complex language and ideas that he was playing with. But what he's going to do is talk about the fact that key line, Ma tovu ohalecha, how goodly are your tents, mishkanetecha, Israel. Why did it use both ohel, tent, and mishkan, dwelling? And also, why is one connected with the name Yaakov, Jacob, and why is one connected with his other name, Israel? And again, this is not meant to be a literal interpretation, but rather a midrashic one, a nice sermon that can inspire. And I really like what he says. So again, this piece is summary and abridgment of what Rav Kook wrote. The evil prophet Balaam wanted to curse the people of Israel, but instead found himself blessing them. Matovu halecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Israel, how goodly are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Is the repetition in Balaam's blessing only poetic, or is there a deeper significance to these 2 forms of shelter, the tent and the mishkan? Again, as I said, dwelling place, or kind of a neighborhood, the journey of the soul. As we strive to grow spiritually, we make use of 2 contradictory yet complementary methods. The first method is our aspiration to constantly improve ourselves. And that's, again, today in the United States, people are constantly self-help books and buying all of the pills and the gym memberships and everything. So that is something that speaks to us today. Not everyone, but a lot of people are like, I got to be better. I got to be smarter. I got to be stronger, healthier. He continues, we strive to attain greater wisdom and enlightenment. We seek to continually refine the emotions and ennoble the spirit. The second method is the necessity to restrain ourselves, our striving for spiritual growth, in order to assimilate changes and guard against spiritual lapses. So someone has a New Year's resolution, and they work really hard at it, and then they don't stop and make sure that it becomes a habit, it'll disappear. And that's usually what happens. Someone gets a gym membership, they go 2 times and they move on to something else. To make going to a gym, just as one example, a regular thing, you got to work through it. You got to do it every week or 3 times a week, whatever, to become a regular person who learns Torah. You can't just every once in a while, if I have 5 minutes, I'll pick it up. It's got to be an everyday thing, which means that if you're constantly trying to add new things, to learn new things, to go on new adventures, none of them will really help you to grow. Sometimes you got to stop, take stock, take a deep breath, and really look at and examine the growth that you've already done and how to make it stick. Continues. We want to internalize our spiritual and ethical gains and maintain our current level. This means that we must curb the desire for growth so that our ambitions do not overextend the soul's natural capacity for change. The tent and the Mishkan are both forms of temporary shelter. Both relate to the soul's upward journey. However, they differ in a significant aspect. The tent is inherently connected to the state of traveling. You fold up your tent, move on, pitch your tent. It corresponds to the aspiration for constant change and growth. The Mishkan is also part of the journey, but it is associated with the rests between travels. It is the soul's sense of calm, its rest from the constant movement for the sake of the overall mission. When you go camping, you keep going, keep moving, keep finding new campsites. The Mishkan is settling down for a while. Like I said, it's almost like a neighborhood. You're committing to a place, actually putting down roots. Even if it's not forever, it's pausing at some point in your life to take stock. Surprisingly, he continues, it is the second method that is the loftier of the two. The desire to change reflects a lower level fear, lest we stagnate and deteriorate. Why are we constantly being better? Because we're convinced we're not good enough. Well, what if you are good enough? What if it's okay to be who you are? Yes, growth and learning is beautiful, but you should also appreciate how wonderful you are. So the desire to change is actually not necessarily a stronger position. Oh, somebody who's always learning new things, wow, they're a better person. Not necessarily. The person who's comfortable, not comfortable, but they appreciate their life. And who is the person who's rich? The one who's happy with their lot. That in some ways is a more challenging position to get to, where someone says, I have a good life and I appreciate what I have. Therefore, the blessing mentions tents first together with the name Jacob, the first and embryonic name of the Jewish people. The need to stop and rest, on the other hand, stems from a higher level fear, lest we overshoot the appropriate level for the soul. For this reason, the blessing mentioned Mishkan together with the name Israel, Jacob's second and holier name. So Jacob is who he was when he was still on his journey to discover his true mission and potential. But once he realized, I'm Israel, God is never going to leave me. God promised me and God fulfills God's promises. Then he's a Mishkan. Then he can set up a permanent home. In any case, we need both aspects in order to achieve stable spiritual growth. Bilam's prophetic blessing praises the balanced union of how goodly are your tents, Jacob, the soul's longing for change, together with the more restful state of your dwelling places, Israel, restricting growth in order to avoid unchecked advancement, thus enabling the soul to properly absorb all spiritual attainments. So this talk is not just inspirational and beautiful and sermonic, it's also very practical and psychological. And it's something that a lot of people forget. They think, I just need to keep growing or exercising or dieting or getting new degrees. But if you keep piling it on, you're going to lose yourself in there. And you're going to have this breadth, but you're going to lack the depth, and it's going to disappear and flutter away. But ultimately, as I said, the most important takeaway of all of this is for us as a people, the Jewish people writ large, to look at ourselves and say, why did God choose us? What is the best thing what does God want us to do? God wants us to care for the poor. How are we doing? God wants us to spread gratitude and wisdom. How are we doing? And if we find that we're not doing well at those things, rather than saying, let's build 50 more shuls, let's build 20 more yeshivas, let's publish 1,000 more works, let's get everybody from and kosher restaurants, maybe step back a moment and say, what are the things that God really wanted us to focus on that we're kind of bulldozing over? And that's a question for Israel. That's a question for Jewish communities around the world. And that's a question for each of us in our lives. Oh, I'm so gung-ho about this Jewish thing and all this stuff. But what really matters? What is really valuable? What is important about the Jewish people? And sometimes we have to step back, and put our focus on the things that God put us here in the first place to focus on.